Let me tell you about the day I watched the smartest being I ever met get proven wrong. Not a little wrong. Not the kind of wrong you cough into your sleeve and walk away from. I mean the kind of wrong that follows a person for the rest of their life. The kind that changes the way they look at their own hands. I was there, I saw all of it, and I still think about it more than I should. My name doesn't matter much for this. Back then everyone just called me the scribe. I was young. I recorded numbers and I carried trays and I kept my mouth shut, which on that station was the smartest thing a person my age could do. But I had a good memory. I still do. That's why I can tell you exactly how it went. It started with a sneer. You have to understand where we were first. Otherwise none of it makes sense. The Concord exchange floated in a slow orbit around a gas giant we called Halo, because of the ring of pale ice dust that wrapped around it and caught the light. Big station. Old station. Built by 7 different species over 400 years, so nothing quite matched. The corridors changed color and texture depending on who had built that section, and if you walked far enough, you could feel gravity shift under your feet by a hair, because none of the founders could agree on what normal weight should be. I grew up half in those corridors, so I can tell you what they felt like. The Vale sections were all smooth stone and low arches, cool to the touch, always a little too dim for my eyes. The Alarian sections were warm and damp, and smelled faintly of the moss they grew on the walls for luck. And the Iskrii sections, where Draoven worked, where I spent most of my hours, those were bright. Painfully bright. White light that never dimmed and never flickered, because the Iskrii believed shadow was where mistakes hid. You could go a whole shift under that light and come out feeling scrubbed raw, like the light had gotten into you and gone looking for your flaws too. It was a medical station. That was the whole point of it. Every species in the Concord sent their sick, their strange cases, their researchers, their students. If a doctor somewhere on the fringe couldn't figure out why a patient was dying, they sent the samples to Halo. We had the best minds. We had machines that could read a single cell like you'd read a page. We had libraries of tissue going back generations, whole cold vaults of it, drawer after drawer. A museum of everything that had ever gone wrong inside a living thing. And we had Draoven Sael. If you've never heard the name, that's fine. Most people outside the sciences haven't. But inside them, in the labs and the lecture halls, that name meant something. Draoven Sael was Iskrii, one of the long-lived ones. His people measured their lives in centuries, not years, and he'd used more centuries than most. He'd been alive so long that some of the medical procedures we all took for granted, he had personally invented. Whole branches of cellular science had grown out of papers he'd written before my grandparents were born. He was, without any argument I ever heard, the best physiologist alive. And he knew it. That's the part people forget when they tell this story secondhand. They make him a villain. He wasn't a villain. He was worse than a villain in a way, because a villain you can dislike cleanly. Draoven you couldn't. He was kind to the sick. He was patient with the dying. I once watched him sit with a small Alarian child for 6 hours, past his own rest cycle, holding a light so the child wouldn't be afraid of the dark, and he never once mentioned it to anyone. But he had a wall inside him. And behind that wall was a very simple belief. One he'd held for so long it had stopped feeling like a belief and started feeling like a fact. He believed that life had a ladder, and his people were near the top of it, and most others were somewhere on the way up. And humans to Draoven Sael, were near the bottom of the ladder, barely on it at all. Let me tell you a little about myself before I go on, because it explains why I never spoke up all those weeks while it mattered. I wasn't Iskrii. I wasn't anybody important. My people were a small folk from a small world on the edge of the Concord, the kind of world nobody visits and nobody remembers. And I'd been sent to Halo as a child the way you'd send a promising seed somewhere it might grow. Work hard, my mother told me. Keep your eyes open and your mouth shut. Be useful and they'll keep you. So that's what I did. I made myself useful to the greatest doctor on the station, and being useful to Draoven Sael meant one thing above all others. You did not offer opinions. You logged. You carried. You handed him the instrument before he asked for it. He tolerated me the way you tolerate a good tool, and a tool that starts talking back is a tool you replace. I tell you this so you understand that when I say I watched all of it and said nothing, it wasn't because I didn't see. I saw. I saw the cruelty in his kindness and the blindness in his brilliance and the wall behind his eyes. But I was young and I was far from home and I wanted to be kept. So I logged and I watched and I remembered. I've had a long time since then to wish I'd been braver sooner. But that's a different story and it comes later, and I'm not ready to tell it yet. I need to explain the humans, because it's where all of this comes from. Humans had only been in the Concord for a short while. A blink, by HFY standards. Nobody had really planned for them. They'd come stumbling out of their little corner of the arm in ships that were, frankly, embarrassing, welded together, patched, leaking heat like a wound. The first human ship any of us ever saw looked like it had been built by scavengers who found the manual halfway through and then argued about it. And their bodies, oh their bodies. You have to see it from our side. Most conquered species had refined themselves over long ages. The HFY had rebuilt their own cells generations ago, edited out the flaws, smoothed the rough parts. The Veil had bones that healed in hours. The Alarians could regrow a lost limb if you gave them a season and enough food. We were, all of us, in one way or another, engineered, polished, finished products. Humans were not. Humans got sick, constantly. They carried around little armies of microbes inside them, some helpful, some not, in a truce that could break at any moment. Their bodies aged badly and openly. You could watch a human decay across a few decades, the way you'd watch fruit go soft on a shelf. They broke bones that took whole months to knit. They scarred. They needed to sleep for a third of every single day or they started to fall apart in the head. They couldn't regrow anything worth mentioning. Cut off a human's finger and it was just gone forever, and they'd grieve it like a death. And they knew they were dying the whole time from the start. That was the part that unsettled a lot of conquered species most. A being that could look at its own hand and know that hand would one day fail and rot and end, and go on making jokes anyway. There was something in that we didn't have a word for. Some of us called it courage. Draoven called it ignorance. He said a creature only laughs at the abyss because it's too simple to understand what it's looking at. He was wrong about that too, as it turned out, but I'm getting ahead of myself. To a being like Draoven, who had spent 500 years perfecting the art of the body, a human looked like a first draft, a rough sketch of a person, something evolution had thrown together in a hurry and never come back to finish. Primitive, that was his word for them, not cruel when he said it, just clinical, the way you'd call a stone tool primitive, useful for its time maybe, interesting in the way old things are interesting, but primitive. He said it in lectures. He said it in his papers. He said it, I would later learn, to the human's face. The human's name was Aldo Ferris. He wasn't a soldier. I mention that because people always assume he was when they hear the story. They picture some hero in armor, some warrior. He wasn't. He was a salvage engineer. 54 years old, which for a human is well into the second half of the road. He fixed broken ships and stripped dead ones for parts, out in the cold places where nobody else wanted to work. His hands were a map of every job he'd ever done, scars, burns, a finger that had healed crooked, calluses on top of calluses. Working hands, old hands. He came to us half dead. His ship had been caught in a reactor bloom, a bad one, the kind that floods everything with radiation in a wave you can't outrun. Everyone else aboard died within the hour. Ferris didn't. He'd been deep in the engine bay behind 3 layers of shielding when it hit, and he'd stayed there, sealing leaks by hand, keeping the ship's air alive long enough for a Concord patrol to find the wreck and pull him out. Think about that for a second. The bloom hits. He knows what it is. A salvage man knows exactly what a bloom is, better than most doctors. He knows the dose he's taking. He knows there's no version of this where he walks away whole. And he stays. He stays in the hot bay and works the leaks with his bare, scarred hands because the ship's air was keeping the rest of the crew alive a few minutes longer, and a few minutes longer was a few minutes closer to rescue. The rest of the crew died anyway, but he didn't know they would when he chose to stay. That's the thing. He made the choice not knowing. He made the choice 100 times over, leak after leak, hour after hour. When they brought him in, the medics who received him gave him a day, maybe 2. The radiation dose he'd absorbed was, by every table we had, fatal. Not serious, fatal. There was a number and he was well past it. His cells should have been coming apart. His marrow should have been dead. By the numbers, this man should have been a corpse that hadn't gotten the news yet. They put him in a recovery ward more out of decency than hope. Give the dying man a soft place, warm light, clean sheets, someone to sit with him at the end. That kind of thing. Draoven took the case because Draoven took all the interesting cases, and a human surviving a fatal dose, even briefly, was interesting to him. He came down to look, the way you'd look at a curiosity in a jar. I came with him because I carried his instruments and I recorded his notes. That was the first time I saw Aldo Ferris. He was sitting up. That's the thing I remember, not lying there. Sitting up in a bed too small for the way humans sprawl, with his back against the wall and a cup of something warm in both hands. His skin had the gray-yellow color of a body that's been badly hurt. There were dark rings under his eyes, so dark they looked bruised. His hands shook a little when he lifted the cup, and some of the drink spilled, and he swore at it softly, and wiped it on the blanket like a man who'd been wiping spills off his knee his whole life. But he was awake, and he was talking to the nurse. Making some small joke I didn't catch, in that low, rough human voice. And the nurse, an Alarian, not an easy species to make laugh, was doing the little throat flutter they do when they think something's funny. Draoven stopped in the doorway. I felt him stop because I nearly walked into his back. He was looking at the readouts floating over the bed. I looked too. The radiation numbers, the cell death markers, the marrow function, all the things that should have been screaming disaster. Half of them were wrong. Not wrong like broken machines, wrong like better than they should be. The cell death rate had slowed. The marrow, which the intake scan had listed as effectively dead, was showing faint activity. Faint, but there. Like an ember you thought was cold, and then you lean close and you see it breathe. I remember Draoven's crest going very still. On an ischry, the crest is where you read them. It's a ridge of soft tissue along the back of the skull, and it moves with their moods, flares when they're interested, flattens when they're bored, ripples when they're thinking hard, stands up sharp when they're angry. His crest went flat and still, which on him meant something rare. It meant he'd seen something that didn't fit. Faulty sensors, he said. That was his first explanation. Say it plainly. He didn't believe the numbers, so he decided the numbers were broken, which, when you think about it, tells you everything. Faced with a human doing something impossible, his first instinct wasn't the human is remarkable. It was the machines must be lying. He had me recalibrate everything. New sensors, fresh scan, full workup. I spent 3 hours on it, my own eyes aching under that white ischry light, checking and rechecking, because if the sensors turned out to be fine and I hadn't caught an error, that would land on me. The sensors were fine. The numbers came back the same. I want to be fair to him here, because it would be easy not to be. A good scientist doubts. That's the job. When you see something that breaks the rules, the first thing you're supposed to do is suspect your own tools, your own eyes, your own hope. Draoven wasn't wrong to doubt. He was right to doubt. The trouble wasn't the doubting. The trouble was that some part of him had already decided what the answer had to be before he ever ran a single test. He decided humans were primitive. He'd built his whole long life on a ladder with humans at the bottom, and a thing at the bottom of the ladder does not survive what Aldo Ferris survived. So instead of the obvious thought, my picture of humans is wrong, his mind went reaching for any other explanation. Faulty sensors, contaminated samples, a recording error. Even at one point the idea that this human simply wasn't human, that he was some other species in disguise, or a modified thing, a lab-grown fake wearing a human face. He said that one out loud actually, wondered if Ferris might be augmented, enhanced. Something dressed up as a human and sent among us as a trick. Ferris heard him. That was the first real moment between them. I was standing right there with the recording plate, so I caught all of it. I've played it back in my head 1,000 times. Draoven had been talking to the ward physician, not to the patient, talking about the patient, the way doctors sometimes forget the sick can hear. He'd said something like, "This one can't be a baseline specimen. The baseline doesn't survive this. Check for augmentation. Check the genome against the registry. I want to know what he really is." And Ferris from the bed, without opening his eyes, said, "He's a guy who fixed a ship." Just that, quiet, tired, not angry even, just correcting the record. Draoven turned. I think it was the first time he really looked at the human as a person and not a chart. He studied him for a moment. Then he said, in that smooth, centuries-old voice of his, the one that had lectured thousands and been contradicted by none, "You survived a lethal exposure. Baseline humans do not do this. So either the exposure was less than recorded or you are more than you appear. Which is it?" And Ferris opened his eyes, gray eyes, bloodshot, steady. "Wasn't less," he said. "I watched the counter, I know what I took." "Then you are enhanced." "Nope. You must be." "Sorry, Doc." A little rasp of a laugh and then a wince because laughing hurt. "Just meat and bad decisions, same as the rest of us." Draoven's crest gave a single ripple, irritation. He didn't like being contradicted, and he especially didn't like being contradicted by a thing he considered primitive. You could feel the temperature of the room change. The way a room changes just before two people who don't like each other decide to make it official. "We'll see," he said. And that "we'll see" was the beginning of the tests. Let me tell you about the tests, because this is where the story really lives. Draoven wanted to prove himself right. I understand that now in a way I didn't then. He wasn't just curious. He was defending something. His whole worldview had a human-shaped crack in it, and he was going to fill that crack with data if it took 100 experiments. So he didn't run one test. He ran everything. He took samples, blood, marrow, skin, muscle, nerve. Ferris let him. That surprised me, honestly. A dying man being needled a dozen times a day by an alien who kept calling his species primitive, and he just rolled up his sleeve every time and said, "Take what you need." Once he even joked that Draoven should charge him for the physical, that no doctor back home had ever paid him this much attention, and he was starting to feel spoiled. Draoven didn't laugh. Draoven was not, in those days, a laughing sort of person. The first test was simple. He wanted to establish for the record exactly how unfinished human cells were. He put a sample of Ferris's cells side by side with samples from 4 other species, HFY, Vale, Alarian, and one of the little edited Concord baselines we used as a reference. Then he stressed them all: heat, cold, toxins, radiation, the standard cruelties, and he measured which cells broke first. He expected the human cells to fold like wet paper. He said as much, right into the record before the test even ran. Prediction: human tissue will show the lowest tolerance across all 4 stressors, consistent with an unoptimized genome. I logged the prediction. I logged the start. Then I logged the result. The human cells did not fold first. They didn't fold last either. I want to be honest. This wasn't a fairy tale where humans win everything. Against pure heat, the HFY cells did better. The Iskrii had engineered themselves for their hot homeworld long ago, and heat to them was home. Against certain toxins, the veil held out longer because the veil came from a world where half the plants would kill you. But against change, against being hit with one thing and then a different thing and then a third, the human cells did something none of the others did. They adapted. I remember Draoven leaning over the readout, very slowly, like a much younger man than he was, like a man who'd forgotten for a moment how old he was. The other species cells were static. You hit them and they endured or they died, but they were the same cells at the end as at the start. That's normal. That's how cells work. You are what you are. The human cells changed while you watched. Hit them with heat, and the survivors came back a little more heat-resistant. Hit those survivors with a toxin, and the ones who lived through that turned on some sleeping stretch of their code and started making a protein to fight it, a protein they hadn't been making an hour before. It was messy. It was inefficient. A lot of the cells died getting there, thousands of them, whole generations of cells thrown into the fire. But the ones who lived kept a memory of what had almost killed them, and they passed it on to the next. Draoven had a word for it. Every scientist did, but he said it like it burned his mouth a little. Plasticity, he said. Human cells were plastic, not fixed, not finished. They were rough and error-prone and they died in droves, but the survivors learned and they didn't stop learning, and there was no ceiling on it that he could find. He kept looking for the ceiling. He'd push a sample further, expecting it to finally hit its limit and shatter, and instead it would just reach again. Try something new. Some of the attempts were failures, ugly failures, cells twisting themselves into shapes that couldn't survive. But enough of them worked. Enough always worked. He ran it again to be sure. Same result. He ran it a third time with fresh samples. Same. The human cells kept doing the impossible thing, getting better at not dying in real time from experience. He stood back from the machine for a long moment. I stood behind him, saying nothing, holding the plate. Then he said the thing that I think was the first honest thing I ever heard him say about humans. That should not be an advantage, he said, quietly. Almost to himself. It's sloppy, it's wasteful, half the cells die to teach the other half. A pause. So why is it working? He didn't have an answer, not yet. But I watched the wall inside him take its first hit that day. Just a hairline, just a crack. There was a second test I have to tell you about, because it's the one that stayed with me longest, and most people who tell this story leave it out. Draoven wanted to test healing directly, so he took 2 small grafts of skin, one from Ferris, one from an Iskrii donor, matched as closely as he could manage, and he grew them side by side in identical conditions. Then he wounded them. The same cut, the same depth, at the same moment by the same machine, and he watched them close. The Iskrii skin healed beautifully. Of course it did. Clean, fast, perfect. The edges drew together like they'd been designed to because they had no scar, no trace. Within a day you couldn't tell it had ever been cut. It was, honestly, lovely to watch. The way a machine is lovely when it does exactly what it was built to do. The human skin was a mess. It swelled. It reddened. It sent all these cells rushing to the wound, far too many, a whole chaotic mob of them, and they fought and they built and they overbuilt, and some of them died, and it was, by every Iskrii standard of elegance, an embarrassment. It took longer. It left a scar, a raised pale line the Iskrii graft would never have. There, Draoven said, and I heard the relief in it. There is the primitive, look at the difference. One heals. The other flails. But then he did something I'll always respect him for, even at his worst. He didn't stop looking. He kept both grafts. And a few days later he did something to them he hadn't planned. He introduced an infection. A nasty one. The kind that gets into a wound and turns it black. The perfect Iskrii skin with its clean, flawless healing had no answer. It had healed for one problem, the cut, and the infection was a different problem, and the finished thing had no idea what to do with a problem it wasn't built for. It sickened. It died. The messy human graft, with its ugly overbuilt scar, with its mob of leftover cells still hanging around the wound like they didn't have anywhere better to be. It had an answer. Those leftover cells, the ones that looked like waste, like inefficiency, like the flailing of something that didn't know when to stop. They turned and met the infection, and they fought it, and they won. The scar, it turned out, wasn't a flaw. The scar was a garrison. The human body had left soldiers at the wound because on the world humans came from, a wound was never just a wound. A wound was an open door, and something always came through it. So they'd learned deep in the flesh, deeper than thought, never fully trust that a danger is over. Keep a guard posted. Overbuild. Stay ready. Draoven looked at the dead perfect graft, and the living ugly one for a long, long time. He didn't say anything that day, but he didn't file the result under primitive either. He just kept it. And I noticed, I logged it actually in my own private way, that he never used the graft test in his lectures again. You'd think that would be enough to change a mind. It wasn't, not his mind, not that fast. Because here's the thing about a belief you've carried for 500 years. It doesn't fall over from one push. It leans, it bends, and then it finds a way to stand back up. Draoven found his way to stand it back up by nightfall. Adaptation is a survival trait of the desperate, he told the ward physician the next morning. I was there. Species that must constantly adapt are species that have never mastered their environment. My people don't adapt like this because we don't need to. We shaped our world to fit us. This, he gestured at the readouts, at the still warm samples of Aldo Ferris, this is not strength. This is the flailing of something that has never been safe. It is the muscle of the perpetually hunted. Admire it if you like. I admire a beast of burden's endurance too. It does not make the beast my equal. And you know what? That's a clever argument. It's even partly true. Humans had never been safe. Their whole history was one long argument with a world trying to kill them. But listen to what he was doing. He'd taken a fact he couldn't deny, that human cells adapted better than anything he'd ever seen, and he'd bent it back into an insult. Their strength became proof of their weakness. See how desperate they are. See how unsafe they've always been. Pity them even. But do not, under any circumstances, respect them. The wall stood back up. But the crack was still there. I'd seen it. And cracks, once they're in the wall, they wait. Ferris got worse before he got better. I should say that because it's true and because it matters, and because if I made it sound easy I'd be lying to you. The adaptation wasn't magic. His body was fighting the radiation the human way, slowly, painfully, at enormous cost. There were 3 days in the middle where I thought Draoven had been right after all, where the numbers turned dark and Ferris stopped joking with the nurses and just lay there, breathing shallow, his gray skin going grayer, his eyes not really tracking the room anymore. Those were bad days. I'll tell you the truth, I didn't want him to die. Somewhere in those first weeks, without meaning to, I'd started to like him. It's hard not to like a man who learns your name when nobody makes him, who asks how your rest cycle went and actually waits for the answer. He'd asked me mine the second day. Nobody on that station had asked me my name in 2 years. Draoven certainly never had. To Draoven I was scribe. To Ferris I was a person, and he wanted to know what to call the person. So those 3 dark days I sat with him when my logging was done. Not because anyone told me to. I just sat there, and sometimes I'd read to him from my logs, the boring number talk of the day, and he said he liked it, said it was better than the silence, said the silence out here got loud if you let it. Draoven watched those 3 days very closely too. I won't say he was hoping, but part of him needed to be right so badly that a colder version of him might have been relieved to see the human finally do the expected thing and die on schedule. I saw him check the failing numbers each morning with a face I couldn't quite read. I've wondered since what he'd have done with himself if Ferris had died. I think it would have been easier for him. I think it would have let the wall stand. And I think, somewhere in him, he knew that, and hated himself a little for the part that wanted it. He didn't die. On the fourth day the marrow numbers ticked up, just a little, then more. His body had, in its clumsy plastic way, been rebuilding the very thing the radiation had destroyed, not from some clean engineered backup like the Iskrii would have kept in reserve, but by forcing the surviving cells to divide and adapt and hold, throwing bodies at the problem until the problem gave ground. Inefficient, wasteful, ugly. And it worked. By the end of the week he was sitting up again, making jokes again, asking for real food instead of the nutrient paste, and complaining loudly when he didn't get it, telling the Alarian nurse that where he came from, they didn't even feed paste to the animals, and the nurse doing the throat flutter and bringing him more paste anyway, and the two of them laughing about it like old friends. Draoven took more samples. Ferris rolled up his sleeve. "You again," the human said. "You know most doctors, they fix you and leave you alone. You keep coming back like I owe you money." "You are the most interesting failure I have ever examined," Draoven said. He meant it as a fact. He genuinely did not understand that it was cruel. That was the strangest thing about him. He could be cruel with no cruelty in his heart at all, the way a wall is hard without meaning to hurt you. Ferris looked at him for a second. Then he laughed, a real one, a tired, rough human laugh from the belly, the kind that had come all the way back now. "Failure," he repeated. "Doc, I'm the last man standing off that whole crew. Everybody else on my ship is dead. Good people, better than me, some of them. And I'm the failure." He shook his head, still smiling, but there was something underneath the smile now, something that had a name, and the name was grief. "You're a funny guy, you know that. You just don't know you're funny, that's the best kind. Never trust a man who knows he's funny." Draoven didn't answer. He took his sample and he left. But I saw his crest as he walked out. It was rippling, thinking hard. Now I have to tell you about the second human, because the story isn't just about Ferris. If it were just Ferris, Draoven might have found a way to call him a freak, an outlier, a 1 in a billion accident, and gone on believing what he wanted to believe. The second human is what took the escape routes away. Her name was Priya Akonkwo-Salas, and she wasn't a patient. She was a doctor, a human doctor, sent to the Concord as part of some exchange program nobody had paid much attention to, because who wanted the primitive newcomer's physician cluttering up the best medical station in the arm? What could a human doctor possibly teach anyone here? She'd been on Halo for 2 months when the Ferris case blew up, working in a quiet corner of the pediatric wing, mostly ignored. I'd seen her around without really seeing her, that's the honest truth, and I'm ashamed of it. She was just there, small and gray-haired and quiet, moving through the edges of the station like someone who'd learned long ago not to expect a welcome and had stopped needing one. I'd walked past her a dozen times and never once wondered who she was or what she knew. That's what a belief does to you, even when it isn't your own. Draoven thought humans were beneath notice, and I worked for Draoven, and so somewhere I'd started not noticing them too. It's the quietest kind of poison. You don't even feel it go in. Here's what I didn't know about her, what I only learned later. On her own world, Priya Akonkwo-Salas was not a nobody. She had spent 40 years as a doctor in the hardest places humans put themselves, the disaster zones, the plague seasons, the refugee flotillas where 1,000 people crammed into a ship built for 200, and the diseases came like weather. She had treated humans in every kind of dying there was. She had buried more patients than most Concord doctors would ever see, and she had saved more than she buried, and she had learned, in all that dying and saving, exactly what a human body was and exactly what it could do when everything said it couldn't. She had read Draoven's papers, all of them, years ago on her own world by whatever light she had. She had admired them even, and she had noticed in the admiring the one thing Draoven had gotten wrong, the thing at the very bottom of all his brilliance, and she had waited patiently, The way she'd learned to wait for everything, for the day she might get to say so to his face. The Ferris case was that day. She came to him. I was in the lab when she did. She just walked in, small woman, dark skin, close-cropped gray hair, moved like someone who'd worked doubles her whole life and learned to conserve every step, spend nothing she didn't have to. She had a data slate in her hand, held down at her side, unhurried. "Dr. Sael," she said, "I've been reading your notes on the Ferris case, the ones you filed to the open registry." Draoven barely looked up. "Then you've read the finest analysis available on a subject you are, I'm certain, personally invested in. Did you have a question?" "A correction," she said. The lab went very quiet. I stopped breathing, I think. My hand stopped over the log. Nobody corrected Draoven Sael, not the senior staff, not the visiting fellows from 4 systems over. Not the proud young Vale researchers who came to Halo cert they were the future of medicine and left quietly a season later, having learned their place. Certainly not a human pediatrician from an exchange program nobody remembered the name of. He set down his instrument, turned to face her fully. His crest flared, not anger yet, but the promise of it, the way the air changes before a storm. "A correction," he said. "You wrote that the adaptive response in his tissue is a desperation trait, the flailing of the unsafe. I'm quoting you." She held up the slate, but she didn't read from it. She'd memorized it. Of course she had. "You're wrong about what it is. Not the data. Your data's good. It's some of the cleanest work I've ever read, I mean that. But what it is. You're wrong about that." "Enlighten me," he said, cold now, very cold. The temperature in the lab seemed to drop with the word. And she did. What she told him, I'll give you the way I understood it, because the technical version would take an hour and I'm not the doctor she was. But I remember the shape of it. I remember it changed the shape of me. She said, "You're looking at human cells and seeing chaos. Cells dying by the thousands to teach the survivors. Waste, mess, desperation. And you're right that it's messy. I won't argue that. It is messy. But you're missing what the mess is for." She said, "Your people, the Iskrii, you perfected yourselves for your world. You edited out the flaws. You built one flawless body and you froze it there because it was good, because it was beautiful, because why would you change perfection? And that worked. Beautifully. For your world. For the world you built it for. But in here," she stepped closer and her voice didn't rise. It never once rose. It just got quieter, and somehow that was worse. "A perfected thing is only perfect for the conditions it was perfected for. Change the conditions and the perfect thing has no answer. It was never built to answer new questions. It was built to be one flawless reply to one old question. And the universe, Dr. Sael, does not keep asking the same question. You of all people should know that. You've lived 500 years. How many times has the question changed on you? And how many times has your perfect body simply refused to change with it?" Draoven said nothing. She went on. "Humans," she said, "never got to answer just one question. Our world wouldn't let us. Ice ages, plagues, deserts, poisoned water, predators, and then when we beat the predators, famine, and then when we beat the famine, floods, and then when we beat the floods, each other. And then when we survived even each other, the sky itself tried to burn us and freeze us by turns. Every few generations the whole test changed. Everything we'd learned became useless and we had to learn again. And the humans who lived weren't the perfect ones. Perfect for what? There was never a stable what to be perfect for. They were the ones who could become something new fast enough to survive the new test." "You call it desperation," she said. "Fine, call it that, I won't stop you. But you're standing there telling me desperation is the opposite of strength, and doctor, on my world, desperation is where all our strength came from. We are the animals that couldn't afford to be finished. So we never finished. We stayed open. On purpose, no, not on purpose, we didn't choose it, the world chose it for us, generation by killing everyone who closed. It cost us everything you'd call refinement. We age, we scar, we get sick. We die stupid, small, undignified deaths. from things your people cured before you were born. And in exchange for all that suffering, we got the one thing your people traded away when you made yourselves perfect." "And what is that?" Draoven said. "Flat." But something had changed in the flatness. It wasn't a challenge anymore. It was almost, I could hardly believe it, almost a real question. "A future you didn't plan for," she said. "That's the whole thing, that's all of it. We are built for the future you didn't plan for. We're not the bottom of your ladder. We're not on your ladder at all. You built a ladder for a world that holds still. We come from a world that never held still for one single day in the whole history of our kind. Different problem, different animal. And when the galaxy throws something at us that nobody planned for, a reactor bloom, a dose off the end of every chart you've got," she nodded once slow, toward the recovery ward where Aldo Ferris was at that very moment almost certainly complaining about the food. "We're the ones who wake up the next morning. Not because we're stronger than you, because we were never allowed to stop getting stronger. There's a difference. It took me 40 years and about 10,000 dead patients to understand the difference. I'm handing it to you for free." The lab was silent, utterly. I could hear the machines humming. I could hear my own hearts. Draoven looked at her for a long, long time. And then he did something I had never seen him do. Not once in the years I'd carried his instruments. Not once in all the lectures and all the arguments and all the proud young fools he'd sent home quiet. He didn't answer. That was the end of the easy part. Everything up to then, Draoven had been able to hold at arm's length. Interesting anomaly, curious outlier, a puzzle to be solved and then filed away under strange but explained. He'd kept the humans in a box marked primitive, and every time the box shook, he'd found a way to hold the lid down. Adaptation, desperation, healing, inefficiency, survival, luck. But you can't hold the lid down when the thing inside is right. She was right, that's what got him, not that she was clever though she was. Not that she was bold, though standing in that lab and correcting him took a kind of nerve I'll never have if I live to be as old as he was. It was that when he went back that night and ran her explanation against his own data. All of it, every test, every number he'd been collecting for weeks, including the graph test he'd quietly stopped using, it fit. It fit better than his own theory. That's the thing about a mind like Draoven's, the thing that in the end saved him. He was proud, God, he was proud, prouder than anyone I've ever known. But under the pride, deeper than the pride, older than the pride, there was something he loved more than being right. He loved the truth. He'd spent 500 years chasing it. And when the truth finally showed up wearing a face he didn't want it to wear, a small, gray-haired human face, a face from the bottom of his ladder, the pride screamed and the truth love, quiet and stubborn and 500 years deep, said, "Yes, that's it. That's the answer. You know it's the answer. You've known for weeks." Her ugly, messy, undignified account of what humans were explained the numbers cleanly. And his elegant ladder didn't. It never had. He'd been forcing the data to fit the ladder for weeks, and a man that's smart can force data a long way, but he can't force it forever, not if he loves the truth, and he did. I know he ran her explanation against the data because I was there. He kept me late. We didn't speak much. He just worked, hour after hour, under that pitiless white light that never dimmed, feeding every scrap of the Ferris case into the models, and I sat in the corner and logged it and watched the smartest being I ever met slowly stop being able to lie to himself. Near the end of the night he stopped. He was looking at a single display. On it was a graph of Aldo Ferris's marrow function over time, the dead ember that had breathed, and then glowed, and then burned. The line that no member of any species Draoven considered his equal could have produced. The line that broke the ladder. He looked at that line for a long time, long enough that I thought he'd forgotten I was there. And then he said very quietly to no one, in a voice I'd never heard him use in all my years with him, thin, old, uncertain, a voice with the wall gone out of it. "How many did I bury?" I didn't understand it then. I do now. He was 500 years old. He treated the sick of 100 worlds. And somewhere in those centuries, humans or things like humans must have come across his table. The messy ones, the plastic ones, the ones who broke the rules, the ones whose numbers looked like disaster and were secretly, if you only knew how to read them, the beginning of a fight. And he would have looked at their strange numbers and thought faulty sensors, contaminated sample, primitive specimen, hopeless case, and he would have treated them by the book. His book. The book for finished creatures. And you don't treat a plastic thing the way you treat a finished thing. You'll kill it. You'll give up on it a week before it would have saved itself. You'll call it dead when it's only just started to fight. You'll pull the light away right as the ember catches, because your book says embers that cold are already ash. How many did I bury? He wasn't asking me. He was asking the empty lab. He was asking the dark that his people had spent so long lighting up, the dark he'd told me once was where mistakes hid. He'd found a mistake in it after all. His own, the biggest one. I didn't answer. What could I have said? Ferris kept getting better. By the third week he was walking the ward on his own, dragging a monitor pole behind him like a reluctant pet, stopping to talk to every patient he passed like he was running for an office nobody had told him about. The other patients loved him. He learned the nurses' names, all of them, in 3 languages, and he got the pronunciations wrong in ways they found so funny they stopped correcting him just to keep hearing it. He taught an Alarian orderly a human card game and lost badly and demanded a rematch every single day, and lost that too, and I think he was losing on purpose, so the orderly, a shy young thing who never wanted anything, would have something to be proud of. That was Ferris. He'd give you a victory and let you think you took it. Draoven watched all of it. He came to the ward more than the case required now, far more. He'd stand at the edge of things with his hands behind his back and just watch. Watch the primitive creature refuse, cheerfully, stubbornly, day after day, hour after hour, to be the thing that Draoven had spent 500 years being sure it was. And I noticed the watching had changed. It wasn't the watching of a scientist over a specimen anymore. I didn't have a word for what it had become. I think the closest word is the one we use for a student watching a teacher he didn't expect to have. One evening I brought him his notes and found him standing at the ward window, looking in at Ferris, who was asleep at last. Finally, the monitor over his bed showing numbers that a month ago would have been called a miracle, and now were just Tuesday. Just a man, sleeping, mending, the ordinary impossible thing that humans do. "Scribe," Draoven said, without turning around. "Doctor, you've logged every test." "Yes, doctor, all of them." "Then log this." He was quiet for a moment. His crest was flat and still, but it was a different stillness now, not the stillness of a thing that doesn't fit, but the stillness of a thing that finally does. I was wrong. I stared at the back of his head. I'd been logging his words for years, and I had never, ever written those 3 words together. I wasn't sure the log would accept them. "Say it again, doctor," I said, and my voice came out strange because I was young and far from home, and I had never in my life had the nerve to ask him to repeat himself. "For the record, so I get it right." He turned, and there was something in his ancient face that I can only call young, cracked open, like a room where somebody had finally thrown open a window that had been painted shut for a lifetime, and the air that came in was cold and sharp and smelled like the outside, like the world, like everything the room had been keeping out. "Write it exactly," he said. "Draoven Sael, chief physiologist, Concord Exchange. In the matter of human cellular function and the matter of the human species entire. I was wrong, not in a small way. In the largest way a physician can be wrong. I looked at strength and I called it weakness because it did not look like my strength. I looked at a different answer and I called it a wrong answer because it was not my answer. I looked at a whole people and I called them unfinished, when the truth," his voice caught, just slightly, the first and only time I ever heard it catch, when the truth is that they are the only ones among us wise enough to never call themselves finished at all. I wrote it. My hand wasn't quite steady, and the letters came out a little crooked, and I left them crooked because it felt wrong to fix them. He watched me write it. Then he looked back through the window at the sleeping human, at the scarred old hands folded on the blanket, the hands that had held a dying ship together long after any sensible body should have quit. "Tomorrow," he said, "I have a great deal of work to do. There are old cases I need to reopen, old graves I need to visit in a manner of speaking, records to correct, apologies to write that will arrive too late for anyone to read them, which is the only kind of apology I have left to give the ones I failed." He drew a slow breath, and it shook just a little. "But tonight I am simply going to stand here for a while, and I am going to watch that man breathe, and I am not going to explain to myself why he shouldn't be able to. I have spent 500 years explaining. Tonight I would like to just see, the way she sees, the way he sees. I think I forgot how somewhere. I think I traded it for being right a long time ago, and I never noticed the price until now." And he did. He stood there a long time. I stood with him. Neither of us spoke. The white light hummed. The human breathed in and out, ordinary and impossible, and the oldest doctor in the Concord watched him do it like it was the first sunrise he'd ever seen. That was the night the wall came down. But it wasn't over. Because the very next morning, a ship came in from the outer stations with something aboard that would take everything Draoven had just learned and put it to a test that could kill someone. Someone small. Someone who couldn't fix a ship or memorize a paper or stand in a lab and correct a legend. Someone who could only lie there and hope the doctors had learned in time. And whether Draoven had truly changed, whether the wall was really down or only leaning, that wouldn't be settled by a graph or an argument or a confession whispered to a sleeping man through glass. It would be settled by whether a child lived or died. The ship came in before the shift bell. I remember that because nothing came in before the shift bell. Halo ran on schedules older than most of the people keeping them, and an unscheduled dock in the gray hours meant one thing only, an emergency running ahead of its own paperwork. I was still half asleep, walking the corridor to the lab with my eyes barely open, when the whole station shivered under my feet the way it did when a heavy craft hit the outer clamps too hard. Too hard means too fast. Too fast means someone up there is trying to beat a clock. By the time I reached the lab, Draoven was already gone. That never happened either. I always arrived to find him working. He slept less than anyone I've known, 4 hours a cycle, sometimes none, and here was his station empty, his instruments untouched, a message light blinking on the console. I keyed it. It was 3 words in his hand. "Pediatric receiving, now." I ran. You have to understand, the pediatric wing was not Draoven's world. He was a physiologist, a researcher. He worked on the deep questions: how a cell lives, how it dies, why one body outlasts another. He didn't do bedside medicine much anymore, and children least of all. It wasn't coldness exactly. He told me once in one of his rare talking moods that he'd stopped taking children's cases a long time ago because the ones he lost stayed with him differently. "An old patient dies and you think, the road ran out," he'd said. "A child dies and you think, I closed the road early." He didn't like carrying that. So he stayed in the lab where the patients were samples in trays, and samples in trays don't have faces. So when I got to pediatric receiving and saw Draoven Sael standing in the middle of it, the great man, out of his lab, in a place he'd spent decades avoiding, I knew before anyone told me that something had gone very wrong. The child was Vale. She was small even for a Vale child, which is saying something, because the Vale are a slight people to begin with. She lay on the receiving table wrapped in a thermal sheet, and her skin, the Vale have skin like fine pale parchment, almost translucent. You can see the shadow of the veins beneath her skin had gone the color of ash. Her breathing was a thin, dry rattle. Her eyes were open, but they weren't looking at anything. There was a smell in the room I knew and hated, a Swedish rot smell, the smell of a body starting to lose to something. Her name was Ise. I learned it from her father, who stood against the wall with the particular stillness of a parent who has been told to stay out of the way and is obeying only because obeying is the last useful thing left to do. He was a dock engineer from one of the outer stations. He'd flown her in himself, 6 hours at emergency burn, because the outer station had no one who could help her, and Halo was the last hope anyone had ever heard of. "What is it?" I asked the receiving physician, quietly, setting up my log out of habit, because logging was the one thing I knew how to do when I didn't know how to do anything. "Gray lace," she said. And my hands went cold. I have to explain gray lace, because if you don't know it, you can't feel what that room felt like. Gray lace was a veiled disease, an old one. It came out of their homeworld, from some deep well of it that nobody had ever fully drained, and it worked on the blood, got into it, and started laying down these fine gray threads, filaments, throughout the vessels, a lattice that spread and thickened until the blood couldn't move right and the body slowly strangled from the inside. You could see it, near the end under the pale veil skin, a delicate gray webbing like lace, spreading out from the heart. That's where the name came from. It was almost beautiful if you didn't know what you were looking at. A lot of terrible things are. The veil had fought gray lace for 1,000 years. And in that 1,000 years, being the refined, engineered people they were, they'd built the perfect defense against it. They designed a treatment, a beautiful treatment, elegant, a single agent that found the gray filaments and dissolved them clean, and it worked every single time. Gray lace in the modern Concord was a solved problem. A child got it, you gave the agent, the child recovered. Nobody died of gray lace anymore. Nobody had died of it in 100 years. Except Ise was going to. Because gray lace had done the thing that finished, perfect solutions can't survive. It had changed. The receiving physician showed Draoven the numbers, and I logged them, and I watched him read them, and I watched the thing he'd learned 3 weeks earlier stop being a philosophy and become a knife at a child's throat. The strain in Ise's blood wasn't the old gray lace. It was a mutant, a drifted form thrown up out of that deep well on her homeworld, different enough that the beautiful, perfect 1,000-year-old treatment did nothing. They'd tried it already on the outer station. Full dose. The agent went in and found the filaments and simply couldn't grip them. The lace had changed its shape, just slightly, just enough, and the perfect key no longer fit the lock. The veil had one answer to gray lace, one flawless reply to one old question, and the question had changed on them. You see it now. You see why Draoven was standing in that room. This was Concord Salas's whole argument, made flesh, made into a dying child. A perfected people, a perfected cure, defeated the instant the problem shifted. The veil physicians on Halo, brilliant, all of them, were standing around that table with nothing, because their medicine was a locked room and they'd only ever been given the one key. "How long?" Draoven said. The receiving physician didn't want to say it in front of the father. She said it anyway because he had a right to it. "Hours. The lattice is past her lungs. When it reaches the heart chambers," she didn't finish. She didn't have to. Ise's father made a sound against the wall, small. He pressed his hand over his own mouth to stop it. Now, here is the part where I have to tell you how Draoven Sael's mind worked, because what he did next, no one else in that room could have done, and it came straight out of the wall coming down 3 weeks before. Everyone else was asking, what is our cure for this? And the answer was, we don't have one. Ours doesn't fit. Draoven asked a different question. He asked, who has already survived a problem that changed? And there was an answer to that. There was a man 3 floors down who had survived a dose off the end of every chart, whose cells had done the impossible thing, who had a body full of the ugliest, messiest, most plastic tissue in the entire Concord. A body that didn't solve problems with one perfect key. A body that grew new keys on the spot, threw away the ones that didn't work, kept the ones that did, and never, ever stopped. Draoven turned to me. His crest was standing straight up, not anger now. I'd learned to tell the difference. This was the other thing it did. The rarest thing. Full, total, blazing focus. Every part of that 500-year-old mind pointed at a single spot. "Get me Ferris," he said. The receiving physician stared. "Doctor, he's a patient. He's barely recovered. You can't possibly." "I don't want to treat him," Draoven said. "I want to ask him something. Scribe now." I ran again. Ferris was awake when I got to his ward. Of course he was. He was sitting up doing something to the card game he'd been losing on purpose, laying the cards out in some pattern, and he took one look at my face and put them down. "Who?" he said. Not what's wrong, not what happened. Who? He'd been on enough dying ships to know that when someone runs into a room with that face, it's always a who. "A child," I said. "Veil, gray lace, a strain we can't treat. Dr. Sael wants you." He was already swinging his legs off the bed. His body wasn't ready for it. I saw the pain go through him, saw him gray out for a second and grab the pole, but he didn't stop. "Wheel me if you have to," he said. "Don't let me slow you down. Let's go." That's the thing about him I want you to hold on to. He didn't ask why an alien doctor who'd called his species primitive for 3 weeks suddenly needed a half-recovered salvage engineer at a child's deathbed. He didn't ask what it had to do with him. A child was dying and he'd been called, and to Aldo Ferris that was the entire conversation. The rest was details you could sort out on the way. When we came into pediatric receiving, the whole room turned. Here was the human, the specimen, the curiosity, the primitive being wheeled in among the finest physicians of 5 species, at the bedside of a dying Veil child. I felt the room's confusion like a temperature. Draoven didn't waste a second on it. "Ferris," he said, "I need to explain something quickly, and I need you to understand it quickly. Can you do that?" "Try me." "This child has a disease of the blood. It builds a lattice here." He brought up the image, the gray webbing spreading under the pale skin, and it strangles her. "There is a cure. It does not work because the disease has changed. Do you follow?" "The lock changed," Ferris said. "Old key's no good." I saw Draoven go still. It was almost word for word what Concord Salas had said. He'd reached the same image on his own, in one breath, a salvage engineer who'd never studied medicine in his life. Because a man who fixes broken machines in the cold understands in his hands the thing the Veil's whole perfect civilization had forgotten, that the universe files the edges off your keys when you're not looking, and you'd better know how to cut new ones. "Yes," Draoven said. "The lock changed. Now, your blood, Ferris. 3 weeks ago you survived a thing that should have killed you because your cells did what no cell of mine could do. They met a problem they had never seen and they built an answer to it in real time and they kept the answer. Your body is, right now, full of that machinery, the machinery of building new keys." Ferris looked at the child. His jaw was tight. "You want my blood?" "I want more than that." Draoven crouched, so he was level with the human, which I had never once seen him do for anyone. "I want to do something that has never been done, and that I cannot promise will work, and that I would not attempt if there were any other road left. I want to take the adaptive factors out of your blood, the living part, the part that learns, and I want to introduce them to hers, to teach her body to do what yours did, to grow a key her own people's medicine cannot grow. It may fail, it may harm her, it may do nothing at all. I have hours to find out and no time to be certain of anything." He paused. "I am asking because it is your body and your risk, and I have spent 3 weeks learning, too late and from better teachers than myself, that I do not get to take from a human without asking. So I am asking." The room was silent. And Aldo Ferris, this man, this scarred 54-year-old salvage engineer who 3 weeks ago had been given a day to live, looked at the doctor who'd called him a primitive failure, and then looked at the ash-gray child dying on the table, and he rolled up his sleeve over an arm still dotted with the marks of 3 weeks of needles, and he said, "Take whatever you need. Take all of it if that's what it takes. What are we waiting for?" I want to stop here for a moment because I think it matters. Nobody made him do it. He owed us nothing. We'd pulled him off a wreck, yes, but we'd also poked and prodded and studied him and talked over his bed like he wasn't in it and called his whole species unfinished to his face. He could have said no. He could have said, "Treat your own patient with your own perfect medicine, Doc, since you're all so much more evolved than me." No one would have blamed him. Some would have understood. He didn't hesitate, not for a breath. And I understood something then about the thing Aldo Ferris had been trying to explain. She talked about human bodies, the plastic cells, the adaptation, the never being finished. But there was a second thing, a thing that didn't show up on any of Draoven's readouts, and I think it was the same thing wearing a different coat. Humans came from a world where the only way anyone survived was by throwing themselves at each other's dying. A world too hard to survive alone. So they'd never finished that either. Never edited it out. Never decided they were too refined for it. A stranger's child was dying in front of Aldo Ferris, and every instinct a million hard years had built into him said the same thing his cells said. Reach for the problem. Give whatever it costs. Don't stop to calculate. Draoven saw it too. I watched him see it. And I think that was the moment, more than any graph, more than any test, that the wall didn't just come down but turned to dust and blew away. Because he finally understood that the thing he'd called primitive wasn't a lower rung on his ladder. It was a different kind of magnificent, one his people had traded away so long ago they'd forgotten they ever had it. But there was no time for any of that. There was only the clock and the gray lace climbing toward a child's heart. "Prep the lab," Draoven said, standing. "All of it. Move her. Move him, move everything. Scribe, you log every second of this, do you understand me? Every second. If this works, I want to know exactly how, so no child ever dies of it again. And if it fails," his voice didn't waver, "I want the record to show exactly whose choice it was. Mine. Write that down first. Write it now." I wrote it. The choice is Draoven Sael's alone. He made me write it before anything else, so that if a child died, no one else would carry it. That was new, too. The old Draoven had never once, in all my years, written his own name next to a risk. The next hours were the longest of my life, and I've had some long ones since. Let me try to tell it the way it happened, because the shape of it matters. First, they took the blood. A lot of it, more than a healthy man should give. Far more than a man 3 weeks off a fatal dose had any business giving. Ferris watched the line fill and made jokes to the frightened father in the corner. Terrible jokes, jokes that shouldn't have worked. And somehow the father's shoulders came down half an inch. And that half an inch was maybe the kindest medicine anyone practiced in that room all day. Then Draoven and the Veil physicians and Aldo Ferris, he'd sent for her too, the second human, the one who'd corrected him. He wanted her in the room, he asked for her. And I saw what that cost his pride, and I saw him pay it without blinking. They went to work on the blood, pulling the living adaptive machinery out of it, the part that learns. I won't pretend I understood the technique. Half of it Draoven was inventing as he went, out loud, thinking in a way I'd never heard a person think. And Aldo Ferris would say no, not like that. In humans it behaves like this, and he would stop and change course and say yes. Yes. You're right, and never once resent it, because there was a child and no time, and the truth was the truth no matter whose mouth it came out of. I want you to picture that. The oldest, proudest physician in the Concord, and the ignored human pediatrician from the exchange program nobody remembered, working the same problem shoulder to shoulder, finishing each other's reasoning, over the body of a dying child. 3 weeks earlier he'd barely looked at her. Now he was building the most important work of his 500-year life on the foundation she'd handed him for free, and he knew it. And he said so once quietly in the middle of it. "I should have listened to you the day you walked in," and she said, without looking up from her work, "You're listening now. Keep going." They gave it to the child, near the 6th hour. By then the gray lace had reached her heart. You could see it under the parchment skin over her chest, the fine gray web spreading with each thin beat. Her breathing had gone from a rattle to something worse, something that stopped and started, and each time it stopped the whole room stopped with it, and each time it started again we all breathed too, like we were doing it for her. They introduced Ferris's adaptive factors into her blood. And then there was nothing to do but wait. That's the part nobody tells you about medicine at the edge. So much of it, at the very end, is just waiting. You do the thing you're not sure will work, and then you stand there, and the machines chart it, and you find out whether you were right by whether a chest keeps rising. Draoven stood at the foot of the table with his hands behind his back, absolutely still, his crest flat. Concord stood at the child's head, one hand resting light on the small skull, the way I imagined she'd stood over 10,000 others. Ferris, too weak now to stand, sat slumped in the wheelchair they'd finally forced on him, gray-faced, watching the monitor with the fixed stare of a man who has given everything he has and now has to watch to see if it was enough. The father had come off the wall at last and was gripping his daughter's small hand in both of his. And I logged, because it was the only thing I could do, and because Draoven had told me to, and because if I stopped logging, I would have to feel what was happening in that room and I wasn't sure I could survive it. For a long time, nothing changed. The gray lattice kept spreading, the breathing kept stopping and starting. And I saw Draoven's certainty, the certainty he'd staked a child's life on. I saw it start to bleed out of him, second by second, and I understood that if this failed, it would not just be a child dead. It would be Draoven back at the bottom of the darkest thought a healer can have. I tried the impossible thing, and it took the last hour she had. He would carry that for however many centuries he had left. I could see him already beginning to. And then the monitor made a sound. I'll never forget the sound. It was such a small sound. A single soft tone, the kind the machine made when a value crossed a threshold, the most ordinary sound in the world. Concord Sael's head came up first. She'd heard it before I understood it. There, she breathed. There. The gray lattice, the filament spreading under Issei's skin, had stopped. Not dissolved, not yet, just stopped spreading, frozen. The web that had been climbing toward the heart chambers for 6 hours simply held. And then, so slowly I thought at first I was seeing what I wanted to see, it began to thin. I looked at the readouts. I made myself read the numbers because I didn't trust my eyes, and I'd been trained by the best not to trust my eyes. And the numbers said it too. Somewhere in that child's blood, Ferris's borrowed machinery had taken hold. It had met the drifted gray lace, the changed lock, the problem her whole perfect people had no key for, and it had done the human thing. It had tried things, thrown answers at it, most failed. But the survivors learned and passed it on and learned again, and in the space of an hour that child's body had grown, from scratch, a key that 1,000 years of veil refinement could not. The lace was dissolving. The lattice under her skin was coming apart, thread by thread, and her breathing, I couldn't believe it, I looked again, her breathing had steadied. Just steadied. In and out. The most ordinary miracle there is. The father made a sound I have no words for. He folded over his daughter's hand and he wept, and no one told him to stay out of the way anymore, because there was no more way to stay out of. I looked at Draoven. The great man was standing exactly where he'd stood for hours, hands behind his back, and he was not moving at all. His crest was flat. His face was still. If you didn't know him, you'd have thought he felt nothing, that he was carved out of the same cold stone as the Vale corridors. But I knew him. I'd carried his instruments for years, and I saw what no one else in that room was looking to see. There was water on his face. I had never seen it. I hadn't known his people could. Maybe they can't mostly. Maybe it takes 500 years and a broken wall and a child breathing who shouldn't be to bring it out of an HFY. He didn't wipe it. I don't think he knew it was there. He just stood and looked at the child and let it run. And then he turned, not to the child, not to Concord Salas, not to me. He turned to Aldo Ferris, slumped gray and half-conscious in the wheelchair, the man whose blood was at that moment saving a stranger's daughter, the man he had spent 3 weeks calling a primitive failure, and Draoven Sael, chief physiologist of the Concord Exchange, the best physiologist alive, 500 years old and never once in any of them known to bow. He bowed low all the way, the full bow his people gave only to their oldest teachers, the ones who'd shaped them, the ones they owed everything. I'd read about that bow. I'd never seen him give it. I don't think anyone living had. He gave it to a salvage engineer. Ferris blinked at him. He was so weak by then I don't think he fully understood what he was seeing. He managed a crooked, exhausted smile. "You're welcome," he rasped, "Doc." And then, because he was who he was, even 3/4 unconscious, "This mean I get out of the paste diet?" And Draoven Sael laughed. I have to tell you, I'd worked for that man for years and I had never heard it. Not once. I hadn't known the sound existed. It came out of him rough and startled, like something breaking loose that had been stuck a very long time, and half the room turned to look because they didn't know what it was either. "Yes," Draoven said when he could. "Yes, anything you want. You will never eat paste again as long as I have anything to say about it. I'll have them bring you whatever your world eats. I'll have it shipped. I'll grow it myself." "Steak," Ferris murmured, eyes closing. "Medium and a chair that reclines. And somebody tell the kid when she wakes up." His voice was going. He was sliding down into the sleep his body had earned 10 times over. "Tell her some old man she never met says she's tougher than the whole galaxy put together. Tell her that. Old salvage guys know tough when they see it." And he was asleep. They took him back to his ward and put more into him than he'd given, and he slept for a day and a half, and every few hours Draoven went and stood at the glass and watched him breathe. The way he had the night the wall came down, except now there was no wall left to come down. There was just an old doctor keeping watch over the man who'd taught him the one thing 500 years hadn't. The child lived. I should say it plainly, in case the shape of the story made you wait for a cruel turn. There wasn't one. Ise lived. By the next day the gray lace was gone from her blood entirely, dissolved by the key her own body had grown from Ferris's borrowed lesson. By the day after she was awake and confused and asking for food, and her father wouldn't leave her side and didn't have to. But listen, because this is the part that made it more than one child saved. Draoven had me log every second, and I had, every step, exactly how the adaptive factors were drawn and readied and introduced, exactly how the child's body took the lesson and grew the cure. And within days that log, my log, the crooked lettered record of the longest hours of my life, was going out from Halo to every station in the Concord that had ever lost a patient to a changed disease. Because gray lace wasn't the only lock that had drifted. Every perfect cure the refined peoples had ever built, every flawless key, was one mutation away from the failure the Veil had just watched happen to theirs. And now there was another way, not a better key, not a more perfect solution to replace the old perfect solution, something else entirely. A way to teach a body to grow its own key on the spot for a lock nobody had ever seen. The human way. The plastic, messy, wasteful, unfinished, unkillable way. The thing Draoven had spent 500 years calling primitive was about to become the most important medicine in the Concord. And he knew it. And instead of putting his own name at the top of the work, the way he'd put his name at the top of every paper for 5 centuries, he put 3 names. Aldo Ferris, Priya a Conquo Salas, and in the place of honor, first of all, a name that wasn't his and wasn't theirs. It was a species. He listed a whole people as the discoverer. Humanity, the record said, for teaching us the question we forgot to keep asking. But I'm getting ahead of the ending again, and there's still part 3, And there are things that happened after that I need to tell you properly. About what the Concord did with all this, and what it cost, and the last conversation I ever had with Draoven Sael, and the thing Ferris said to me before he left that I've carried my whole life since. Because a wall coming down is not the end of a story. It's the middle. The end is what you build in the empty space where the wall used to be. The first thing that happened was that nobody believed it. That sounds strange after everything, but you have to understand how the Concord worked. 500 years of Draoven's own teaching had told every doctor in the arm the same thing he'd believed, that there was a ladder, that the refined peoples were near the top of it, and that the answers to hard problems came from more refinement, more perfection, better keys. And here was a record, my record, going out from the most respected medical station in the arm, saying the exact opposite, saying the answer had come from the least refined body anyone knew, saying the cure for the perfect cure's failure was to be less finished, not more. The pushback was immediate and it was loud. There were physicians on a dozen stations who read the Ferris log and simply refused it. It was a fluke, they said, a one-off. You could not build medicine on the blood of a primitive. Some of them said it in words very close to the ones Draoven himself had used 3 weeks earlier, and I don't think a single one of them heard the echo. And this is the part I most want you to know about Draoven Sael, because it would have been so easy for him, at that moment, to go quiet, to let the pushback win, to file the Ferris case as an oddity and go back to his lab and his elegant work and his long, safe life, and never again have to stand in front of his peers and say the humiliating thing. He didn't. He took the fight. At 500 years old, with a reputation he'd spent 5 centuries building, he stood up in front of the assembled Concord Medical Council. I was there, I logged it, and he told them in that voice that had never once been contradicted before Aldo Ferris walked into his lab that he had been wrong. Not delicately. Not with the little escape hatches great men leave themselves. He stood up and he said, I taught you the ladder. I was wrong about the ladder. There is no ladder. There are only different answers to different worlds, and the humans have the answer to the world none of us can predict, and I spent 500 years too proud to see it, and how many of your patients died in that time because you trusted my pride. You could have heard a pin drop across the whole council. He put his own name on the line to make them believe it. He spent the reputation. He'd hoarded that reputation for 5 centuries, and he spent all of it in one afternoon to buy the truth a hearing. And because it was him, because it was Draoven Sael, of all beings, saying I was wrong, they couldn't dismiss it. If he'd been anyone else, they'd have laughed it off. But the man who built the ladder had just kicked it over with his own foot, and that they could not ignore. That was the price. I told you there was a price. The price was his pride, all of it, paid in public on purpose, and he paid it like a man setting down something heavy he'd carried too long and too far. The medicine spread. Slowly at first, and then not slowly at all. Within a season, the technique that had saved Issei was saving others, not just from gray lace, but from the whole family of failures the refined peoples had been quietly dying from for generations and calling bad luck. Every time a perfect cure met a drifted disease and failed, there was now a second road. Teach the body to grow its own answer, the human way. They gave it a proper name eventually, some long technical Concord name, and I've forgotten it honestly because everyone who actually used it called it something else. They called it the open path, because that was the heart of it. The human's great gift wasn't a cure. It was the refusal to ever be finished. The willingness to stay open, to keep learning, to never once believe you'd reach the top of any ladder. Because the moment you believe that is the moment the world changes the question and leaves you standing there with your perfect, useless key. Human doctors stopped being ignored. Aldo Ferris, who'd spent 2 months as a nobody in a quiet corner of the pediatric wing, was asked to stay on and teach. The exchange program nobody had paid attention to suddenly had a waiting list a system long. Whole delegations came to Halo to learn from the very people the Concord had spent a generation looking down on. I like to think about that. All those refined, ancient, perfected peoples lining up to be taught by the messy ones, the unfinished ones. The ones who scarred and sickened and died small, stupid deaths and never, ever stopped fighting. The world turned over, and it turned over because one old doctor loved the truth more than he loved being right. Ferris healed. I won't pretend it was a full healing. It wasn't. His body had been through a fatal dose, and then he'd given more blood than a well man should twice for a stranger's child, and even the great human plasticity has a cost, and he'd paid it. He was never quite as strong after. He tired easier. His hands, those working hands, shook a little more than they had. The salvage life was behind him. There was no going back to sealing leaks in cold engine bays. That door had closed. He didn't seem to mind. That was the thing about him. He'd look at his shaking hands and shrug and say, "Well, they got the job done. Can't ask more than that of a pair of hands." He said the same thing about the rest of himself, more or less, right up to the end. He stayed on Halo a while. He didn't have anywhere to go, his crew was dead, his ship was scrap, and the outer stations he'd worked out of were a long, cold way from anywhere he'd want to die. So he stayed, and Draoven, who could refuse him nothing now, made sure he had a good room and real food and that reclining chair he'd asked for, half-conscious in the middle of saving a life. And the two of them, the old doctor and the old salvage man, they became friends, real friends. It still astonishes me when I say it. The proudest being in the Concord and the human he'd called a primitive failure, sitting together in the evenings, playing that terrible card game Ferris had taught the orderly, Draoven losing every single time because he could not for the life of him grasp why a game would have rules that made no sense, and Ferris laughing at him, and Draoven, this is the part, Draoven laughing back. He'd found the laugh. Late, after 500 years, an old salvage man had shown him where he'd left it. Issa came to visit when she was well. She was shy of the big alien doctor, but not of Ferris. Children were never shy of Ferris. She'd climb up in his lap, and he'd tell her stories about ships and cold places and the crew he'd lost, made gentle enough for a child, made into adventures instead of what they were. And she'd fall asleep on him, and he'd sit very still so as not to wake her, this tough old man with a sleeping veil child on his chest, and Draoven would watch the two of them with an expression I'd never have believed his face could make in all the years before. I think those were the best days of Ferris's life. I hope they were. He'd earned them. God, he'd earned them. But he was a human, and humans, as Concord Salas had said, die stupid small deaths from things the refined peoples cured before they were born. I want to be honest with you about this, because the whole story has been about honesty, about looking at the truth even when you'd rather not. Ferris didn't die of anything grand. He didn't die saving another child or sealing another leak. He got old. That was all. The dose and the blood loss had taken years off a life that didn't have many to spare to begin with, and one ordinary morning, about 2 years after he'd saved Issei, his ordinary human heart, the messy, unfinished, plastic organ that had already outrun a death sentence once, simply came to the end of its road. He died in the good room in the reclining chair in his sleep. Draoven was with him. The great doctor who could have kept almost anyone else alive for a century sat beside the one patient he could not save, because there is no cure for the road running out, and held the old man's shaking hand until it went still. I've thought about that a great deal since, that the finest physiologist in the Concord, who had by then completely remade galactic medicine around the human gift, could do nothing for the human himself. And I don't think it was a cruelty. I think it was the last lesson. Because the same thing that made humans magnificent, the never being finished, the staying open, the paying of everything to meet each new problem, was the same thing that wore them out and used them up and made their lives so short and so bright. The glory and the flaw were the same thing. You couldn't have one without the other. Ferris was mortal because he was the kind of creature that could grow a key from nothing. His whole species burned that hot and that fast for the same reason they could survive anything. They refused to stop, and refusing to stop has a cost, and the cost is you don't last. Draoven understood that at the end. He said it to me, the night Ferris died, and it was the last real conversation I ever had with him. We were in the lab. The good white light, which I'd hated my whole time on Halo, felt different that night, too bright for grief, the way that light was too bright for everything. Draoven was very still. His crest was flat. He'd been that way for hours. "Scribe," he said, "you've logged a great deal for me over the years." "Yes, Doctor." "Log one more thing, not for the record, for yourself. Keep it and remember it, because I am old and I will not always be here to say it, and someone should carry it after I'm gone." I set down the plate. I didn't log it, I just listened. It felt wrong to log it. "I spent 500 years, he said, trying to make myself perfect. My people did. We edited out every flaw. We built ourselves into a flawless answer, and we were proud of it, and we called everyone who hadn't done the same thing primitive. And do you know what I learned, Scribe, at the very end, from a man who fixed broken ships?" "What, Doctor?" "That perfect is another word for finished," he said, "and finished is another word for dead. We made ourselves perfect and we stopped. We stopped changing, stopped learning, stopped growing because we thought we'd arrived. And Ferris," his voice, the ancient smooth voice that had lectured 100 worlds, went rough. "Ferris was never perfect for a single day of his short, ugly, magnificent life. He was scarred and sick and dying the whole way through. And he was more alive than I have been in 5 centuries, because he never once believed he was finished. Neither did his cells, neither did his heart. They all just kept reaching, right up until the reaching killed them, and they'd have done it again, and again forever, if forever had been on offer." He was quiet a long moment. "I used to pity them," he said, "the short-lived ones, the unfinished ones. I used to think, what a sad thing to burn so bright and so brief. And now I have 500 years, and I have watched a man live 56, and I am not certain, Scribe. I am no longer certain which of us got the better trade. He had less time, but I am not sure he had less life." He looked at his own hands then, his unscarred, flawless, 500-year-old hands that had never had to grow a key from nothing, that had never fought a leak in a cold bay knowing it wouldn't save anyone, that had been perfect their whole long unfinished with life. "I think," he said very quietly, "I would trade some of my centuries for one of his scars. I don't think that's a thing I'm allowed to want, but I think I want it." He lived a long time after that. His people do. He kept working, he kept the fight going, kept teaching the open path, kept humbly, publicly, at every chance, giving the credit away from himself and toward the messy ones who'd earned it. He never went back to the way he'd been. The wall didn't just come down. He salted the ground where it had stood so nothing like it could grow again. But he was different after Ferris. Softer in the way old things get soft, the good way, the way that lets more of the world in. He took children's cases again, the ones he'd stopped taking because losing them stayed with him differently. He said, when I asked him why, "Because now I know that closing a road early is the worst thing a healer can do." And I spent 500 years closing roads on an entire people, because I thought I already knew where they ended. I have some roads to keep open. It's the only apology I have left to give him. I stayed on Halo a while longer, and then my own road took me elsewhere, the way roads do. But before I left, Ferris, this was in those good 2 years before the end, Ferris told me something I've carried ever since. I said I'd tell you back at the start. This is it. I'd asked him, young and foolish and full of the thing I'd caught from working under Draoven, I'd asked him whether it bothered him, being called primitive all those weeks, being studied like a specimen, being looked down on by beings who'd lived 10 of his lifetimes and never once do a fraction of what he'd done. And he thought about it, in that way he had, turning it over with his scarred, crooked hands as if it were a part he was deciding whether to keep. "Nah," he said finally, You know why? Because primitive just means old. Means you come from way back from the hard times, from before things got soft and easy and safe. And where I come from, kid, that's not an insult. He grinned, that tired, crooked human grin. That's a pedigree. Every one of my ancestors looked at a world that was trying to kill them and said, not today. Every single one, all the way back. That's what's in my blood. That's what saved that little girl. So the doc can call me primitive all he wants. He tapped his chest over that unfinished, plastic, magnificent, doomed human heart. Primitive's the toughest thing there is, he said. Primitive is what's still standing after everything else got too perfect to survive. He's gone now, of course. Long gone. So is Draoven in the end, though it took a great many years and he spent every one of them keeping roads open. The child, Is, grew up and became a doctor herself, and she practices the open path and she teaches it. And I'm told she keeps a picture of an old human salvage engineer on the wall of wherever she works. And when the young ones ask who it is, she just says, the toughest man who ever lived. He never knew my name and he gave me my whole life anyway. And me, I'm old myself now. I logged the numbers and carried the trays and kept my mouth shut, and I was there for all of it. And I've spent the rest of my life telling it to anyone who will sit still long enough. Because someone should. Because Draoven asked me to carry it and I said I would. So here's what I carry. Here's the whole thing if you strip away the station and the disease and the long argument and the child on the table. Here it is. The smartest being who ever lived spent 500 years certain that the humans were primitive, unfinished, sloppy, a rough first draft that evolution never came back to polish. And then the tests proved otherwise. They didn't prove the humans were perfect. That was never it. The tests proved something the perfect peoples had forgotten so long ago. They'd built whole civilizations on not knowing it. They proved that being finished is the same as being dead. They proved that the scar and the strength are the same thing, and you don't get to keep one and throw away the other. And they proved that the toughest thing in the whole wide galaxy, tougher than the long-lived and the flawless and the refined, tougher than 500 years of pride, is a mortal, scarred, dying creature who looks at a world built to kill it, and simply, stubbornly, gloriously refuses to stop reaching. Not today, his ancestors said, every one of them, all the way back. Not today.